Let's do one more little quick review of people I've met over my career here in Alamosa. This is John Smith. John Smith is an attorney. He's dead now. He died, I think, at age 72, 73, something like that. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer in his 60s, but the doctors told him, you'll live long enough, it'll never kill you. They were wrong. It did kill him. Anyway, John's a twin. He and his twin brother both graduated law school, University of Missouri. And how they ended up in Alamosa, I am not certain. But they were here long before I got here. And John was elected the DA, and Don was a judge. So it was kind of like the old ham and egg in the legal business. Anyway, they practiced law for a while, but they were mostly infamous for all their partying and chasing women. John once told me, he says, drinking and chasing women is a full-time job. There's no time to do anything else if that's what you're doing. And he should know. He chased a lot of them. He was a real womanizer. Had a wonderful wife. She outlived him a little bit. Very nice woman who was a pharmacist. A few years older than John. Typical story. I think she helped put him through law school. Anyway, I may have to check that because he may have graduated from DU as a lawyer, but he came from Missouri, and maybe his undergraduate was in Missouri. Anyway, so he finally figured out and decided that being a lawyer was fine, and it worked out good. And he spent a lot of time at the Elks and played a lot of cards down at the Elks. It was back in the old days when Elks were fun. Now it's not. Anyway, so he decided one day that he got the opportunity to participate in buying a farm out southeast of Alamosa. And this farm was undeveloped, and the opportunity came around from a guy named Charlie Baldwin. Well, Charlie Baldwin was the son of the person I bought the John Deere store from. And he essentially was just like John, spent a lot of time at the Elks, spent a lot of time drinking, spent a lot of time doing stuff because his dad and mom would always bail him out whenever he got in trouble. And he frequently got in trouble. So somehow or another, he decided it'd be a good idea to buy this farm outside of town here. And when it was fully developed, I think it had 35 sprinkler circles on it, plus it had a bunch of ranch land too. Ran across along the river, essentially a tributary to the Rio Grande that comes from Blanca, Smith Reservoir, Mountain Home Reservoir. So one day, Charles was his father's name, Charles Baldwin. Chuck had bought this, Owen Baldwin, not Charles. Owen Baldwin was his father's name. So Chuck had bought this ranch. Somehow or another, then Owen had figured out how to pay for it. And then one day, Chuck comes into his dad and he says, "Hey, there's a guy coming in from Nebraska today. He's going to talk to us about pivots out there on the new farm, because the center pivot irrigation is what has made irrigation work in the United States. It's relatively new. Even when I got here in the early 80s, there was over 1,500 pivots, but they were still putting them up anywhere they could get a well permit. So this guy shows up, and he walks in and he says, "Okay, I'm here with your contract to buy the pivots." And Owen says, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "Oh, your son ordered all these pivots. He ordered like 25 pivots." And Owen said, "What? I didn't know anything about this." And of course, his son wasn't there. He'd taken off. And but they went ahead and put in the pivots. But it's out in the middle of the desert, so there's no electricity. So they're out there, and so now they need a couple different things. One thing is they need a way to power the pivots with electricity and pump the water. But first of all, they need the well permits. Well, guess who is an attorney in town who knows the water engineer in Denver? That's right, John Smith. So John gets involved in this, and his brother, and Owen and Chuck. So there's 4 of them. And John wanders up to Denver, and he tells me the story that he goes into the water engineers, and the water engineer says, "Oh, so you need some well permits down there in San Luis Valley, huh?" John says, "Yeah, we want to put up some farming down there." And the guy says, "Well, how many do you want?" And he says, "You said you wanted like 20 or 25, didn't you?" And John says, "Yeah, that's right." And he says, "All right." Signs the paperwork. And that's how John got the well permits. So it's on the tributary of the river. It's not a real big problem getting water, but some of the water is fairly deep. But when they found out they drilled some of the wells, there was so much water that I think one well down there was running 4 pivots at least, and that's 1,000 gallons a minute for each, so that's 4,000 gallons a minute. That's a lot of water. All right, so now they got the pivots. They got the farm. Owen is a John Deere dealer, so he has the equipment. Now they need the to get power and electricity. Well, the way to do that back then is if you're out off grid, then you get a diesel motor. And on the end of the diesel motor, there's a generator that provides electricity to run the pivot, and the other end, you hook up the pump and you pump the water. So Owen orders up from John Deere like 25 diesel motors. And so John Deere says, "All right, they're here." So John and Owen says, "Well, we need to get those out here. We got to find a way to do it." Well, guess who they get to do it? That's right, Bill Gallagher. So they call up old Bill and say, "Hey, Bill, will you take your truck back here and pick up all these motors for us?" And Bill said, "Yeah, sure, you pay me, I'll go." I got a truck, and I've been hauling hay and stuff like that. So he goes back to Dubuque, Iowa, picks up the stationary motors, and he's on his way back. And back in those days, they had ports of entry at every state. So you had to come to the port of entry, go inside. If you're overweight, you get a fine, or you got to buy a permit or something like that. So the guy at one of the port of entry looks at Bill Gallagher, and he says, "That's a lot of motors, isn't it?" And he says, "Yeah, that's quite a few." And he says, "You know, you're not allowed to haul those commercially. Do those all belong to you?" And of course, old Bill Gallagher, the quick thinker that he is, "Yeah, they're all mine." So they wave him on through and say, "All right." And he never heard from him again. So, but back then the trucking laws were really strict because the truck companies were trying to control everything. So he gets back, and Owen and Chuck, and Chuck was an idea man. He wasn't really much for working, but he had a lot of ideas. So they wander out there and they start developing that farm, and they did develop that farm. And they developed it, and there's a ranch too. They didn't do much with the ranch, but it was there. And they go along for a long time there. And then just before I bought the business from Owen Baldwin in 1979, his son and he and the cough drop brothers, they call them, because the 2 Smith twins, back in the old days, there were some cough drops that were, it was called Smith's cough drops. So that's why they called them the cough drop brothers. They find in the early 80s, in the late 70s, all of Europe is afraid of the bear, the Russians. And they think, these days the Russians are going to sweep through Europe and we'll be back at war again. So a bunch of the Germans over there, it's probably about 4 or 5 of them at least, they decide we need a place to go if the Russians show up where it will be safe for our families and us. And they're pretty wealthy because they had worked at reconstruction from World War II really hard. I mean, they did it with trucking, and one of them, old Hans made his money in the gravel business, building roads and things like that. So they had a lot of money, but they're afraid of the bear. So they wander over here and they buy that farm from the Coughdrop brothers and Owen Baldwin and his son, Chuck. And Owen always told me that after they sold that each of them made $1 million. Now, in 1980 or 1978, somewhere in that neighborhood, $1 million was real money. So it was about that time that he decided that it wouldn't hurt him to sell the John Deere business, and I was dumb enough to, I called him up one night from a hotel room. I worked up my courage and said, hey, you want to sell that business? I'd like to buy it. And he was really good about it, and he and his wife Doris, they both were ready to sell, and so he didn't loan me any money, but he got his bank, the Alamosa National Bank back in those days, to loan me some SBA money, and that's how I bought the business. Well, in the meantime, his son Chuck, remember the idea man, he and another guy, they were running a land deal. Somebody might call it a land scheme or a land fraud. Anyway, out on the desert east of town here. And what they had done is they'd gone out there and bought up the desert. Was basically, there's nothing there, barely sagebrush. And they'd take a road grader and go out there and knock out some roads. And then they'd stand there with a telephoto lens and take a picture of Mount Blanca. And they put it in the Reader's Digest and said, you too can own a place in beautiful Colorado. And it showed this beautiful mountain picture. And they take monthly payments. So people would buy those lots out there, sight unseen, and they, maybe it's $100 a month, $200 a month, I don't know. But his partner was Danny O'Keefe. And this Irishman and Chuck, they just raked in the money. I mean, they had these stupid people from all over, and they were just sending the money and buying those lots out there. But no one ever came out, and if they did come out and look at it, they'd say, oh, this is a desert. There's no electricity, there's no water, there's no sewer, there's no roads. We've been had. And sometimes they'd quit making the payments, but that's all right. Chuck and Danny, they just take them back, redo the paperwork, and sell them to somebody else. Well, everything was going along just fine, and they were just making a ton of money, but the two of them decide that if they made that money, they should get to keep it, which means they didn't pay the taxes. So one day, old Chuck was out here getting ready to get on an airplane with a big suitcase to go to Australia. The FBI catches him at the gate, arrests his takes his money, charges him with tax evasion. So I asked Owen several years after this, like 5 years later, I said, how'd you ever keep him out of jail? Because he did. Other than the arrest, Chuck never spent a night in jail. Now, Danny, on the other hand, didn't have a rich and influential father, so he went to jail. And he spent, 3-5 years, something like that. And we got out of jail. He didn't come back here. He went to California and opened a hot dog stand out there on the beach. So I have a feeling that he still had some of that money put away somewhere. Anyway, Owen told me, he says, we fought the IRS on that. And he said, it took a long time, took a lot of money, a lot of lawyers. But he said, actually what happened is if you drag it out long enough, the subsequent losses from that whole real estate thing, you could legally carry back against your gains in the years forward. And he says when we got all done with it, the losses covered up what he didn't pay taxes on. So he basically got loose with a big penalty. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, but I can see it happening. So anyway, Owen, he takes his money from the sale of that farm and the money I gave him for buying this property, which wasn't a lot, but back then dollars were a lot bigger than they are now. And he wanders over to northeast of Trinidad. And when he gets over there, he buys this ranch, and it's called the Wineglass Ranch. And it's a big ranch, and it's out there in the middle of the desert. I mean, there's nothing around there but jackrabbits and cows. Well, funny thing happens is the Army, excuse me, the Army comes along from Fort Carson. Fort Carson's up by Colorado Springs, but it's by Colorado Springs. And they come along, they say, hey, we don't have enough land to practice. And by practice, they meant drive tanks and shoot guns and do our real artillery, live fire. I'm going to buy your ranch. And they wanted to buy a couple others over there too. And Owen's, all right, they get it appraised, and it is worth a ton of money. I mean, it's a huge amount of money by that time. He got more than the Jewish 1%. So I asked him one time, how'd you get that done? And he said, in order for the Army to buy that land over there, they had to get an act of Congress. So he said, I had to get the deal done, had to go to Washington, D.C. and hire some lobbyists. And not only did I get it pushed through Congress with a funding bill to pay for it, I got him to throw in that it was tax-free. So he made all that profit of that Wineglass Ranch and didn't even have to pay taxes on it. So he learned something from Chuck's little problem with the IRS. So anyway, after that, he loved to feed cows, he loved to drink whiskey, and he loved to play cards. So he fed a lot of cows over at La Hun, Lamar. I mean, a lot, hundreds, thousands of cows. And then he got a little older, and then Chuck says, I got a great idea. Let's buy a ranch up at Steamboat Springs. So sure enough, they take that money, wander up there west of Steamboat Springs and buy these heritage ranches up there, as many as they can buy. And Steamboat is a huge, huge ski town. But now it's, all the elite, rich people are in there. And I don't know what happened. Chuck's gone now. I think he had a daughter. I don't know what happened to all those ranches, but I know it's hard to even put a value on what they were worth. So anyway, back to John Smith. So John Smith, he was involved in some of this, maybe not all of it. But once he got out of the farm down here, we call it the German farm because the Germans have bought it. He doesn't want to go back practicing law because that's too boring, so he decides to start farming himself. And he starts out a little bit small, and he gets a little help from Bill Gallagher and his whole clique, but he's still drinking whiskey and chasing women. And he ends up buying some different ranches, and he goes down to La Hera, and he buys some ranches down there. And back then, the big deal around here that made money was potatoes. And I mean, you could make a lot of money compared to anything else. If you hit it just right, you get pretty wealthy. So he wanders down there. With the problem with that land down there, even though it had good water and all that, it was in a hail zone. So I got a lot of hail, but mostly had rocks. Rocks. I mean, rocks. Big as your head, but a lot of them big as baseballs. So the problem is not that you can't raise potatoes, because you can't. The problem is you can't harvest them. So he gets Bill Gallagher to put up a bunch of potato sheds down there for him. They're hay sheds now, because the guys who bought it after John sold it, they put hay in there. Put up a bunch of potato sheds. And back then, I was just getting started in Center Parts Store selling potato equipment. Well, one of the pieces of equipment that those guys made, and it kind of worked, but it was like a science fiction device. And what would happen is you dig up the potatoes and the rocks and everything, and you put it in the machine. The machine was full of sand, real fine sand. And then they'd blow air up through the sand. And so they would bubble that sand. And when they did that, the potatoes were lighter weight than the rocks. So the rocks would fall to the bottom, and the potatoes would go over the top. Then at the end of the machine, you'd pick up the rocks and carry them away. And there were millions of rocks, billions of rocks. But all the time that you're turning those rocks with those potatoes, the rocks were chewing up the potatoes. So even though technically it worked, and it probably wasn't the problem with the quality of potatoes, it was a problem. And the potatoes, they sold okay, but they didn't sell great because they had a lot of damage. But it gave John experience there, and he figured out, all right, I can make some money in potatoes, but I'm not going to make it in these rocks. So he sells that place down there to a bunch of hay farmers, and it's fine with him because hay grows above ground, not below ground. And he goes up to center and starts buying a bunch of land up there and grows potatoes and does okay. And then he decides, well, the real money to be made in this potato business is putting them in bags, packing them in boxes, selling them the retail side. Well, in the meantime, he was also in the spinach business and the lettuce business. And so he calls Bill Gallagher again, says, build me a potato shed. So they go up there, build a whole bunch more potato storage, plus they build a shed to put all the machines in to process the potatoes, put them in bags, boxes, and everything like that. Still there. Still owned by the company, Skyview Cooling, and still making money. And at the same time, he was growing spinach and lettuce, and he had to have these big vacuum coolers that would, you'd get the lettuce out of the field, and it'd be like 80 degrees or so. Well, you had to cool it down or it'd rot. And the process for doing that's an old process, but an effective process. Essentially, you put it in this giant tube and you suck all the air out. Well, when you suck all the air out, it sucks all the heat out too, because the moisture turns cold. It's like an evaporative cooler, only a really big one. So he was doing that, and he was doing spinach. Spinach is a little different because you had to do ice. So he had an ice plant here in Alamosa right across the street. And I went over there one time, and there's this huge, huge room. It's like 100 by 200. And the whole thing, all sides, including the ceiling, lined with cork. Cork. That was the insulator that they used back in the 40s when they built the thing. And they used anhydrous ammonia as the chemical to run the compressors, and then the anhydrous ammonia would make the ice, essentially. That's how air conditioning works. And every once in a while they'd have a little leak, and it all smelled like anhydrous ammonia all over town. Well, oddly, they take that ice, and then they had a big grinder, and they'd grind it up into crushed ice about this big. And then they'd take scoops of that ice and they'd throw it in baskets of spinach. And so they had field workers, real Mexicans, that would go through the field, cut bushel baskets of spinach. They'd raise up half the spinach, scoop some ice in there, put the spinach back down, put another scoop of ice on top, and then put the top on the basket. And these were real wicker baskets, not wicker, but they were real organic baskets. They weren't plastic. Then they'd stack all those, put them on a reefer truck, and send them back east. Because back then, they grew a lot of spinach back east because there's a lot of Jewish people on the East Coast that like to eat spinach. The problem is in the summertime it rained too much back there. And when it rains on spinach, it would get mold. And so you couldn't ship it for fresh consumption. So out here, we didn't have that problem because it doesn't rain here. We get 7 inches of moisture and almost none of it in the summertime. And so we grew high quality spinach and send it back east, and it was a great market. Also a great market for lamb. We grew a lot of lamb here. Same thing, Jewish people were eating lamb, eating spinach. Guys over at Blanket like Charlie Hayashida, probably the spinach king of the United States, made millions just in summer spinach shipping to the East Coast. Now, later on, as things go, varieties got better and chemicals got better and the susceptibility to mold lessened to the point where I think they probably can grow spinach pretty good on the East Coast. Plus, I think that generation probably just quit eating as much. Anyway, one more story about John. His ice plant one day burns down, catches on fire, burned for days and days and days, and all that cork burned up. So he knocked it all down and eventually carried it all off and finally gave the land to the Boys and Girls Club. And that's how we get a Boys and Girls Club in Alamosa. He gave them the land. So good on him. You had to get EPA approvals and all that stuff and so. And I was over there one day and they were all approved. They're starting digging and there was just a big track hoe digging foundations and they hooked this giant fuel tank, this old dead fuel tank. So I asked John, what are you going to do with that? And he said, we're all the way to bury it. That's what we're going to do. And he did. The whole place was totally contaminated. Those old metal tanks had leaked gas everywhere. So, but anyway, the Boys and Girls Club don't know. They're fine. It all dissipated anyway. So anyway, now John's farms, now he's gone. His son Vic and is still, and John Jr., they still own the farms. But now they grow carrots, world-class carrots that Gerber uses to make baby food out of. And the latest thing the last couple of years, they grow beets. All of a sudden, someone's come up with this big promotion that beets are good for you. Beet juice, beet everything. So they don't actually even grow potatoes. But they still have a potato business that packs potatoes, but they have to buy them from someone else. So last story about John is he was a pilot also. He liked to fly. So one day he says, hey, Fred, you want to go to the Tulare Farm Show? And I said, well, yeah, how long have you gone? No, just overnight. And I said, all right, when are we leaving? He says, like 5 o'clock in the morning. We want to be there when it opens. I said, okay. So I wander out to the airport, and he's got a Turbo 210. And he's got a buddy with him who's in the construction business. He's sitting in the back. And he says, all right, let's go. And by this time, I had bought a 210, also a Turbo 210. So I was familiar and current in that airplane. So I was co-pilot. So we take off, pitch dark. It's so friggin' dark. You can't see. It's like the inside of a cow. You can't see anything. So we started heading west toward California, and I look over at John. I said, John, do you know where we're going? I said, nah. He says, really you waste a lot of time planning these trips. Basically, just get in the air and then figure it out from there. And I said, well, okay. But there's a mountain right over there called Wolf Creek Pass, and we're heading straight for it. Do you think we ought to do that? And he said, no, that's probably not a good idea. And so I get the chart out, get a flashlight, and I say, all right, turn right here, and we got to stop for gas anyway. So we turn right, and we miss all the mountains, obviously, and we get out to Cedar, Utah, Cedar City. And I stopped there several times before. Great place. It's got a little restaurant there. So we stop and get some gas, get back in the airplane, head off to California. John's flying, and we get out there to Tulare. And Tulare's just a little farm town. But they had started this thing with having these ag shows. And this show was about irrigation, which is kind of interesting because we do a lot of irrigation. So we get out there and we turn and we get on the Unicom, and John's flying and he's coming down, and I'm looking at him, and he's kind of missed the first part of the runway, and he lands about halfway down. And I look at him, and he says, I don't think we're going to make it. We better go around. So puts the gas to it, and off we go. And I mean, it was no problem. But I was looking down, and there's this 10-foot tall corn. I'm thinking, that's pretty close. So we go around again. This time he gets slowed down, makes a good landing, and everything. So we go to the show, and it was all about irrigation, drip irrigation, different things. It was all just getting started. A lot of it from Israel back then. So we wander around there until about lunchtime, and I look at John, so I'm done. And he says, well, I'm done. And I said, well, what are we going to do now? And he says, well, let's head home. And I said, okay, let's go. And I said, which way do you want to go? And he says, Las Vegas. I said, what? He said, yeah, let's spend the night in Las Vegas. I said, all right. And we get out to the airplane. He says, you fly. I don't want to fly anymore. I said, okay. So I get in the airplane and take off, and we head to Las Vegas, go to McCarran International. I'd never been to a place like that. And he said, it's no problem. Just talk to them. They'll tell you what to do. They did. So we get to Las Vegas, and we don't have reservations or anything. It doesn't matter. John's been there before. So we get over to the hotel and get all checked in, and he says, I'm going to go gamble for a while. And I said, all right, fine. And he says, we'll have dinner. And I said, all right, well, tell me when and where. And he says, well, there's a restaurant upstairs from the casino. And I said, fine, I'm going to go play some cards and do something, and I'll meet you there. And so we met at that restaurant. And I'm not saying they knew John. They probably didn't. But, I mean, it was a nice restaurant. It was an expensive restaurant. Ate, drank, everything. John says, no problem, my treat. Says, hotel rooms, all that. Says, let's go have some fun, gamble some more, and we'll leave in the morning, which we did. So the next morning we get out to the airplane, and John says, you fly. I'm tired of flying. I said, all right, fine, I love to fly. So I get in the airplane, and we head back to Alamosa from Las Vegas. It's only about 3 hours. And the weather was good and all that. It was the summertime. Anyway, we get back to Alamosa, and John says, that's pretty good. He says, you're okay. And I'd been with him one time before, and we went to Kansas City for a tractor auction. So we went to Kansas City and came back the same day, and he flew both ways. And we got over western Kansas. He says, I'm going to take a nap. You fly for a while. Okay. So he's over. He slept for about an hour while I flew the airplane. Anyway, but so after that, John started making some money. And then he had always taken his coolers down in New Mexico to cool crops down there, and mostly lettuce. And he expanded that, and expanded. So Yuma was his home base, and he lived down in Yuma. He lived in a condo on a golf course. He always lived in a condo on a golf course. He lived in a condo here. He retired to a condo in Colorado Springs on the golf course. He loved to play golf. I played with him several times. He was a good golfer. And he got to make a lot of money, and he made some other investments. Some were good, some were bad, but that's just the way he was. He says, all you got to do is win more than you lose. And I said, okay. He ended up bought a King Air, which he always wanted and he liked, but he found out it burned a lot of gas and didn't really go that fast. And but he still liked it, so they ended up buying a little light jet. And he liked that a lot faster. He liked that better because it's really super fast. So anyway, John didn't work for me as a lawyer, but he always gave me free advice. And the best advice he ever gave me was, Fred, possession's 9/10 of the law. And I always remember that. Because back in the day, when things were rocking and rolling, there are a lot of bad hombres in this country. We call them one-year wonders. And maybe I'll do a segment on one-year wonders, but I'll just finish with this. One time I sold a one-year wonder a whole bunch of equipment. It was in the fall, and it's October, and I couldn't get him to pay for it. So I got him to to sign the contracts. He gave me a down payment check, and I think the down payment check is $40,000. Now back then, $40,000 is a lot of money. And so I took it over to the bank, Bank of Monte Vista, which is now the Sunflower Bank. And I said, I want to cash this. And they disappear into the back, and they don't come back, and they don't come back. I knew there was something up. So I finally wander back there, and here those cheating bastards are sitting there at a table. They're trying to call this guy. His name's Campbell. And because there's no money in the account. And they can't get a hold of him. That was before cell phones or anything. And I said, well, either give me the money or mark it insufficient funds. And so they couldn't give me the money because there wasn't any money there. So they marked it insufficient. I brought it back, and that was on a Friday. And Saturday morning, I remember what old John told me, possession's 9/10 of the law. So Saturday morning, my crew and I, we went up to that farm, and we repossessed all of that equipment, all those tractors. We took people off of them, and they were doing work, and we said, get off. We're repossessing these. And Campbell was nowhere around. But one of his hired hands up there was a convicted bank robber named Monty Geringer, who had been in prison for robbing banks. So we drove them all back to Alamosa, locked them up behind the fence, disabled them some, and I went home and I told Diantha, I said, let's get out of here. This is not going to be good. And so we loaded up in our old station wagon with the kids, drove to Albuquerque. It was a balloon festival. So we went down there, saw Aunt Burl, watched the balloons, and I always told Diantha, well, this is your first time with interstate flight to avoid arrest. They called the cops. They called everybody. But it didn't matter because, I mean, he didn't have any intention of ever paying for that equipment. And so he just basically left the country, stole from everybody he could. And I didn't make any money. I lost a lot of money on that thing, but I got my equipment back, and I didn't end up in his bankruptcy court. So thank you, John Smith. Your advice was exactly right. I don't know if I'd get away with that again today, but I got away with it that day. He's a good old dude. I always liked old John.